My name is Leah Middlebrook, and I am the director of the Oregon Humanities Center. On behalf of the center, I welcome you to the first endowed lecture in our 2024-2025 season of programming. We have a theme this year, which is Reimagine. Our events this year highlight the original human superpower, our mind's capacity to transform the world around us via imaginative thought. How might we use the power of the human imagination and reimagination to engage creatively and critically with the circumstances of our lives? What new insights and research questions will be uncovered in the reimagining process? And what new, more equitable and nourishing pathways can be forged? Patty Krawec, our speaker today, addresses these questions under the auspices of our Clark Lecture in the Humanities. The Clark Lecture was established in 1994 and has been sustained since then through the generosity of the Oregon Community Foundation. We are grateful for the Foundation's steadfast support of the humanities and the OHC. The lectureship was named for UO President Emeritus Robert D. Clark. The Oregon Humanities Center celebrates a 42-year tradition of our mission to promote and strengthen the humanities, both on campus and in the wider community, to support humanities research and teaching, to foster collaboration among the disciplines, and to sponsor free public programming such as this one. As I reflect on this mission as the newest director of the OHC, I am struck that a common denominator unites all these activities, namely the OHC's commitment to building spaces for conversation. We create or co-create and co-sponsor occasions to gather, listen, talk, and learn in community with the intention of widening and deepening our understanding, both about the rich variety of life worlds and knowledges that surround us, and about our ethical obligations to live as good neighbors among and within those life worlds, as kin, as our guest Patty Krawec would say. The OHC consistently shows up for this fundamental sustaining human activity. And I'm grateful that our community, everyone here, everyone watching the live stream, and everyone who will later be watching the recording, I'm grateful that our community shows up for the OHC. This is an important time to advocate for our mission. I would also like to thank our donors, the OHC Board of Visitors, our Faculty Advisory Board, and crucially, the OHC staff and our student workers for their efforts and labors in support of the center. We open our events with a land acknowledgement developed by our colleagues in Native American and Indigenous Studies and in consultation with the Grand Ronde and Siletz tribes. The University of Oregon is located on Kalapuya Ilihi, the traditional indigenous homeland of the Kalapuya people. Following treaties between 1851 and 1855, Kalapuya people were dispossessed of their indigenous homeland by the United States government and forcibly removed to the Coast Reservation in Western Oregon. Today, Kalapuya descendants are primarily citizens of the Confederated Tribes of the Grand Ronde and the Confederated Tribes of Siletz Indians, and they continue to make important contributions to their communities, to the UO, to the lands now known as Oregon, and to the world. In following the Indigenous protocol of acknowledging the original people of the land we occupy, we also extend our respect to the 9 federally recognized Indigenous nations of Oregon, the Burns-Paiute tribe, the Confederated Tribes of the Coos, Lower Umpqua, and Siuslaw Indians, the Confederated Tribes of the Grand Ronde, the Confederated Tribes of Siletz, the Confederated Tribes of the Umatilla and Indian Reservation, the Confederated Tribes of Warm Springs, the Coquille Indian Tribe, the Cow Creek Band of Umpqua Tribe of Indians, and the Klamath Tribes. We express our respect to the many more tribes who have ancestral connections to this territory, as well as to all displaced and Indigenous people who call this place, which we call Oregon, home. We give this land acknowledgement to both publicly honor the long-standing and ongoing relationships of the Kalapuya and other Indigenous peoples maintain with their homelands, and to remind ourselves and our institutions of responsibilities and obligations we have to advance Indigenous sovereignty, to prioritize Indigenous knowledges and lifeways, and to support Indigenous education on our campus. When Patty Krawec and I were talking earlier this morning, she pointed out that such statements should be seen as a beginning, an opening to ongoing work. They're not an ending. The OHC strives to follow up on this beginning through co-sponsorships, fellowships, and programming that centers Indigenous research, practices, and knowledges and pedagogies, weaving them into the wider frameworks of this public institution. You can find more information about our activities by perusing our website and looking through episodes of UO Today on YouTube and on SoundCloud. But today we are honored and delighted to welcome Patty Krawec as our Clark Lecturer. Patty Krawec is an Ojibwe, Anishinaabe, and Ukrainian writer and speaker belonging to the Lac Seul First Nation in Treaty 3 territory in Canada. She has served on the board of the Fort Erie Native Friendship Center and co-hosted the Medicine for the Resistance podcast, which I highly recommend. She is a founding director of the Nikigana Foundation, which challenges settlers to pay their rent for living on Indigenous land and then disperses those funds to Indigenous people, both meeting immediate survival needs and supporting the organizing and community building necessary to addressing the structural issues that create those needs. With a background in social work, Patty focused on supporting victims of sexual and gendered violence, as well as child abuse. She is a strong believer in the power of collective organizing and was an active union member throughout her career as a social worker. Her current work is on how Anishinaabe belonging and thought can inform faith and social justice practices. Her writing has been published in Sojourners, Rampant Magazine, Midnight Sun, Yellowhead Institute, Indigenews, Religion News Service, and Broadview. In her first book, Becoming Kin, An Indigenous Call to Unforgetting the Past and Reimagining Our Future, published in 2022 by Broadleaf Books, Krawec critiques the harmful impact of European Christian settler colonialism on Indigenous Americans. She details Indigenous American history from the first humans to populate the Americas through the present, and outlines ways in which descendants of European colonizers and Indigenous people can become good relatives. Her second forthcoming book, Bad Indians Book Club, Reading at the Edge of 1,000 Worlds, will be published in September of this year. In this book, Krawec examines research in history, gender, and science, as well as literary fiction, all written from the perspective of bad Indians, marginalized people whose refusal to comply with dominant narratives opens up new worlds. Bad Indians Book Club offers a potent challenge to all the stories settler colonialism tells. Stories that erase and appropriate, deny and deflect. Today, Patty will speak on the topic of surviving together. Please join me in welcoming Patty Krawec.
So anin bujo wabnan anagonko Indigenous adik and dodum. Obishko kang and Dunjaba Niagara and Dunjaba Ojibwe Anishinaabe Kwayandao. Yes, so my tat's name is Patty. My clan is Caribou. Caribou, in the Ojibwe tradition, we weren't very good at being humans. Anishinaabe just means the people, and we weren't very good at it. And so the animals took pity on us and agreed to become human. And so we are descended from the Caribou who agreed to become human. And if you want to look at what our clan responsibilities are, we would just look at how Caribou behave. Which, they're herd animals. They're really good at finding food in tricky places. They travel long distances, just, kind of like me. They have social responsibilities. It's no surprise, apparently, that I became a social worker. So I am also the daughter of Roy Wesley. He was from Lac Seul First Nation. His father and all the fathers back to Noah and Moses, which he likes to say we were descended from Moses and Noah. And they were members of Fort Albany Band. And there was a big bit of drama on the Wesley Facebook group when we realized that if Noah and Moses were from Fort Albany, that's Cree territory. So are we actually Cree? And there was a whole bunch of drama. We were like, no, we're Ojibwe, it's cool. But I don't know, maybe we're Cree, like who knows? I'm also the daughter of Vicky, and Vicky is a refugee. She and my maternal grandparents, Anne and George, came from Germany after World War II. So Anne and George first fled separately, individually from Stalin's Russia to Hitler's Germany, eventually becoming the American-occupied part of Germany, and then they came here to Canada, where my grandfather lived his entire life under the name of my grandmother's first husband, because, of course, when you defect from the Soviet army, they don't give you your papers. So he had to use my grandmother's papers. And so when I think about those relations that I bring into the room, the land relations, the genetic relations, I think about all of the communities that I am kin to. Through my father, I am kin to the Ojibwe people of Northwestern Ontario. Through my mother's family, I am kin to migrants and refugees. I am kin to people who did not enter this place through conventional means, right? My grandfather came here with false papers. They weren't his papers. He lived his whole life under somebody else's name. He came in illegally. So I think about my responsibility to them. How am I bringing their legacy forward into this world? How am I wrestling with that legacy, with the legacy of a German grandmother who found safety in Hitler's Germany? Because she was German, right? She was part of that crowd that Catherine the Great brought to Ukraine to displace Ukrainian planters, Ukrainian farmers. They set up these little colonies that stayed very self-contained along the Dnieper River. And they were treated very badly during the Russian, after the Russian Revolution. So apologies if there's any tankies in the room. I have no sympathy for you. And you'll have to Google tanky if you don't know what that means. Anyway, so I think about that. That's part of my legacy, is that my grandmother found safety in a country that was profoundly unsafe for a lot of people. And then they migrated here. And they found more safety on lands that the Mississauga Anishinaabe had been dispossessed from. So what then, instead of ignoring these stories or trying to sanitize them or absolve them, how do I bring these stories into my present? How do I wrestle with the gap between what was and what could be? And that's a lot of what Becoming Kin was from. Because I'm also a social worker. And it turns out that social work is really good training for reviewing history and looking for patterns, which is what I did with Becoming Kin. I analyzed Canadian and US history, looking for patterns to see, how did we get here? How did things get so bad? And it turns out that for certain populations, things have always been bad. Right? If we're going to make America great again, we have to ask the question, who was it ever great for? And so that's, and so social work was really good training for that. Becoming Kin came out of anger. It came out of a sermon that erased people and, kind of made light of identity politics. And although he didn't use the term, I'm sure he would have said, woke, talked about wokeism as well, but he didn't. But he talked about, identity politics being out of control, and that made me angry. It made me angry that he talked about that at the expense of trans people, and made me angry that the congregation laughed. And it occurred to me after an afternoon of posting on Facebook, which made me feel no better at all. That's weird, right? You'd think that posting on social media would make you feel better, but it didn't, and I'm sure it didn't accomplish anything either. I realized that I could use my writing to confront injustice. That I didn't just have to post on social media or seethe to my friends, that I could actually mobilize my writing to make a difference. And so I did. I published a magazine article, which an acquisitions editor saw and asked me if I'd ever thought of writing a book. And I told her, I am now. Now that you mention it, I am. So I was taught to introduce myself with my name, my clan, my community, my nation, so that people would know the location that I speak from, the communities that I belong to. I set my intentions. right? We give you kind of the bird's eye view of what we're going to say in our introduction. We're going to talk about surviving together. We're going to talk about, for my computer nerds in the room, we're going to talk about binaries and ones and zeros. We call in the past and present and future generations to remind us that while our words may live in the present, they are rooted in what came before and lay the groundwork for what is yet to come. Where we are from is, we just talked a little bit, is a fraught question, particularly right now, when it's being used to justify the worst kind of violence against anyone deemed to be out of place. In this context, where we are from determines where we're supposed to be and gives government, as well as those it deputizes formally and informally, the right to remove anyone it decides belongs someplace else. I hear this all the time when I bring up land back, as if restoring the land to itself would mean replicating the racial higher categories and hard boundaries of our current world. Used this way, where are you from is a question of suspicion rather than curiosity. But this is all very recent. It doesn't have to be that way. Where you are from can be the beginning of relationship and an understanding of what you bring with you to this place. The people, the ancestors, the land relations that you bring to this space. And I think it is important. Indigenous people do this all the time. We locate ourselves with our genealogy and our land relations. I've noticed Black writers doing this a lot. Everybody should be doing this. Readers should be doing this. As you engage, with a speaker, the podcast or a book, think about your own relations. Who are you bringing into that room? Because that shapes how you hear those people. That shapes how you decide. Erna Kin Hackett says that Christians have a bad case of Disney princess syndrome. They always think that they're the princess in the story. Whatever the story is, they're the princess. They're the one who needs rescuing. And that's just not the fact. They always think of themselves as poor exiled Israel, but never as invading, conquering Babylon. And so when you think about your location, when you think about your ancestors and who you're bringing into the room, the ancestors that you may not want to acknowledge, that you may not want to think about, the grandmother who found safety in Hitler's Germany, you're bringing that forward into the room and understanding how you are hearing somebody else's words and where you might fit in the story, because you may not, in fact, be the princess. The Anishinaabe have two ways of saying we. There is Ninwe, which is exclusive. It means us. We're going to Disneyland, but not you. And it could also, but then there's also Ginwe, which is inclusive. We are all going to Disneyland, which sounds pretty great. I like Disneyland, and I don't care that it's in Florida. So what exactly do we mean by we? This was a question I asked labor organizers when I addressed a May Day gathering a few years ago. What do we mean by we when we talk about workers, when we organize against injustice? The Chicago Teachers Union, I think most famously, has asked the city not just for better wages and better working conditions, but for rent controls and for the things that their students need that the city can provide in terms of safe, stable housing, access to medical care, and all of those things that cities can provide. They asked for that in their collective agreement. And so as I addressed these, many of them were transit workers, I was like, accessible housing and accessible healthcare is a workplace safety issue for transit operators, because your job is going to be a lot safer if people have their own homes to have their crisis in. Because we all have crises, right? We just don't have them in a tent in a park where people are staring at us. So I asked them, what exactly do you mean by we when you're entering collective negotiations? But also, I just finished a book about cobalt being mined in Congo. Not writing it, reading it. All of that cobalt that powers our electronics is touched by unfree labor, by child labor in the most horrific, I knew things were bad, I had no idea, in the most horrific conditions. So as a person from a labor background, the former secretary of my union local, what do we mean by we when we're thinking about the unfree labor that builds our world? Too often it means us, but not you. In becoming kin and the work that I do in sharing and thinking about the stories that shape us, I hope that we as a society can move towards an us that includes you. Us but not you is not always bad. Sometimes in our emphasis on creating safe spaces, we forget that in order for the most vulnerable to even be safe, we must also be hostile towards those who are hostile to them. When we think about safe spaces, we have to think about who they are safe for and who we are willing to sacrifice in order to protect those people. So the Anishinaabe have a story about the time that the deer abandoned us. And I tell the story in Becoming Kin. I return to it again and again and again because it's just such a rich story. The short version is, as always, the human part was behaving very badly. The Anishinaabe, we were behaving bad. We weren't taking care of the forest. It was not a good place for the deer to want to live. We were not taking care of the deer. We were being very careless. And so they were like, you know what? I know we promised to take care of these humans, but if they exterminate us, we won't be here to help them anyway. And so the deer pieced out. And the Anishinaabe at first got very confused. They were like, where did the deer go? And then the other animals are like, oh, hold up. Because one deer can feed a whole family for the winter, but I'm just a little beaver. And they're gonna need to take all of us. So maybe they pieced out too, I have no idea, but I'm sure they got stressed out. And then winter comes, right? And so what do we do in the winter? Netflix and chill. So we're hanging around in the wigwams, telling stories, laughing at, inappropriate humor because we're all living together. And then somebody must have realized that we weren't the princess in that story. That maybe, because we come back to our traditional stories all the time, and Nana Boudreau, you don't want to wear a bracelet that says, what would Nana Boudreau do? Because chances are you don't want to do that thing. But a lot of the stories are very funny, and it's good, and it's nice to laugh at somebody else getting theirs. But at some point you realize that you're the bad guy in that story. Because why did the deer leave? Why did the other animals go? Like, wait a minute, are we the baddies, as the meme says? And so over the course of that winter, they sang their songs, they told their stories, they thought about them differently. And I have to believe that the deer were watching and paying attention to what we were doing, because one little deer allowed himself to be found in the spring. And I think if they thought we still posed a threat to them, they would not have showed up. So this one little deer shows up, and the Anishinaabe are like, where'd you go? What happened? And the deer are like, come and listen. We'll tell you. And so the Anishinaabe went. And they didn't just send like their favorite politicians. They sent everybody, right? They sent their elders, their youth, their children, their grandmothers, their aunties. They sent the leaders, the ceremony people, because everybody has a thing to learn. Everybody has a different way that they're going to hear. And it's important that there's witnesses when victims tell their stories. And so it's not just the people, the Anishinaabe, who had to hear that truth. It was the witnesses who were listening, who may have been telling them all along that you're behaving badly and something's going to go wrong, acting as witnesses. And so they listened for as long as they needed to. And then when the deer were satisfied that everything was going to be okay, then they formed a new relationship. And I tell that story in Becoming Kin because it's important to what we're doing as a society. That we recognize that sometimes vulnerable people that are being exploited and harmed need time apart, that not everything is for everyone. That's an us excluding you that keeps people safe. But it's an us excluding you that is intended to move back towards relationship. And I've done workshops before. Like, could you imagine listening to me for like 2.5 days? Like, some people actually sign up for that. And we would break into like discussion groups. And because I had a white co-facilitator who's, skilled at doing this kind of work, she said, you know what, why don't we separate along affinity lines, and we'll have all the white people come with me, and you can have like the 3 non-white people who signed up. So I had a great conversation with some non-white educators about, things that they wanted to do in their school, while she was with like the other 25 who were devastated and upset at being, we're not supposed to segregate. We're supposed to be together. Segregation is wrong, which they're right, but it's all in who does it and to what end. And so, so the deer took their time apart, but it was with the intention of moving back into relationship. And so I just kind of want you to hold that story in your heads. So I'm currently reading 78 Lacks of Liberation, Tarot to Transform Our World by Lane Smith, a white, trans, non-binary social justice activist in Baltimore, Maryland. And they brought up a very interesting thing about ones, twos, and zeros. And apologies to everybody who was in that room with me this morning. You're hearing it again. In a binary system, for my computer geeks in the room, there are ones and zeros. In our system, there are men, and then there are various failures to measure up. In this binary system, men are the ones, and the rest of us are zeros. This is the patriarchy of the Western world, rooted in a misinterpreted and misread story that suggests that the original creation was man and woman was an afterthought who ruined everything through failure and deceit. This was my struggle when I convened a panel on gender for a podcast series I did a few years ago that has become, that became the book Bad Indians Book Club. How would I frame all of these people as zeros in there's zeros in a binary system in a way that did not render them as meaningless? Why do we have men on one side and then women on the other, along with two-spirit, lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans, queer, intersex, and asexual on the other side? And how do I talk about that in a way that does not, one way or another, center the very thing I'm not talking about? We struggle with this as Indigenous people as well. How do we define ourselves against settler colonialism without accepting that one way or another we're zeros against their one? They're one against which they must constantly defend themselves in order to retain their singular status. How do we talk about ourselves? A woman I follow on Twitter posted the question as a student of decolonial studies. Our world is divided into pre and post contact. She wanted a way to talk about those changes or even life before contact without centering colonization, because you call it pre-contact, you're centering contact. Because that also wasn't the only contact that we've ever had with other people, right? Like, all of our stories contain stories of how we interacted with other people and traded and traveled with other people. There are Viking settlements in Newfoundland and Labrador. They came here and they traded with the Beothuk people. The Pacifica people are a seafaring people. Like, do we really want to believe that they went all the way to Easter Island and Hawaii and never came any closer? That they didn't get to the Aleutian Islands? We really want to believe that? So contact, this wasn't our only contact, and yet that was the contact that changed everything. That was the contact that introduced a binary vision to our world, against which they alone were the humans, and the rest of us are various failures to measure up. And if you doubt me on that, think about all of the ways that we still talk about civilization and progress and the developing world. Indigenous is a definition that comes from that negation, from that need to define an us that is both inclusive and exclusive, a global us against a colonial them. Quechua Jewish writer Daniel Delgado gives us a great explanation of the word indigenous in his essay on whether Jews are indigenous to Palestine, which was published as a guest blog on Rabbi Danya Rutenberg's blog, Life is a Sacred Text, which, if you're interested at all in Jewish thinking, I would highly recommend. Indigenous, he says, is an intrinsically political term created in response to colonialism. As a term, it emerged from the Indigenous peoples movement of the 70s as an explicitly internationalist term to highlight the common experiences of people around the world who have been colonized by European powers, which includes the state of Israel. A Western state, this is what these aren't Daniel's words, but this is what he's saying, a Western state created by anti-Semites who refused to reckon with the reasons for why Jewish people were unsafe in their countries and did what they always do. The colonial states, England and the US, did what they always do, which is exclude and deport with complete disregard for the people who are in the places that they are sending the unwanted people to. Ethno-states is a strategy that emerged after World War II. Remember the breakup of Yugoslavia and all of the violence of that. Ethno-states popped up all over the place because it became this idea that we will only be safe if we come together in our little country and draw a hard circle around it, and then we will be safe. Except think about the violence that requires to maintain. The violence it requires to create in the first place. Ronaldo Walcott wrote an essay for Briarpatch magazine about the failures of Liberia, which was supposed to be a place for freed slaves to go, except that there were already people living there. And they came home with a colonial mentality. They were going to bring civilization to the people who were left behind. And so Ronaldo Walcott talks about that ethno-states do not keep us safe. And worse, they create scores of stateless people who belong nowhere and live everywhere under the shadow of suspicion. So indigeneity not only comes from that negation, it is also a kind of negation, a refusal to accept the othering of names like Indian. Because before that happened, we just thought of ourselves as the people. And what was interesting to me, my publisher was kind of concerned about Bad Indians Book Club, that people from the country of India might not appreciate that. So I hit up a bunch of my friends who are from India, and I said, like, what do you think about that? And they're like, like, no, like, it's totally cool. And the reason it was totally cool was because I use it exactly the same way they use it. And India applies to the peoples of India exactly the same way that Indian applies to the peoples here. That was also not their name for themselves. That's what the Europeans called them in the 13th century, the people of the Indus Valley. So they didn't even call themselves. So Indian really is a broad term for people we can't be bothered to learn anything about and we just want to be the boss of. That's my definition, you can quote me. For the most part, indigenous communities named themselves the people, many calling themselves the people of the big river mouths, such as the Mississauga, Anishinaabe. We understood ourselves according to our land relations, and that's how we named ourselves. We also need to think about power in our conversations. We need to think about who has it, who doesn't, how it's being used. We need to think about the center that we revolve around. Who are we permitting to set the terms of reference, the terms of engagement? The world would have us believe that there are white, mostly Christian, able, cis-bodied men, and then various failures to measure up. There are ones and zeros. Or there are twos, as well as zeros. Contrary to the typical reading of that creation story, Eve was not a zero. She was not an afterthought. There are other more radical ways to read that ancient text, because in the original Hebrew, Adam wasn't male. Ha-Adam was a genderless creature. And Ha-Adam didn't become Adam until the Creator said, it's not good for you to be alone, and turned the one into two. That's when Adam becomes male and Eve comes female. That, to me, speaks of continuum. And I'm sorry, y'all, first being created, non-binary. Tell that to your pastor. My Jewish friends taught me this. They taught me, raised in evangelicalism, another way to read that old story, which set me off for other ways to read other stories in ways that expanded my vision rather than shrinking it. The Anishinaabe, along with many other tribal groups, have long recognized the expansiveness of two, which is not to say that one is isolating and two is expansive. The mere presence of two allows for a general expansiveness. Leanne Bettis-Amosaki-Simpson writes about the expansiveness of kwe, the Anishinaabe word for woman, as a term that includes two-spirit, lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans, queer, intersex, and asexual. But so does nin, which is our word for man. So this isn't a one and a zero. This is a one and a two, which opens up a whole world of possibility. It doesn't just offer 3, 4, 5, and so on. If I remember my high school physics correctly, there are infinite numbers between 1 and 2. Infinite worlds that layer with other worlds. There are also zeros. We know this. There are people who are negated and ignored, people who are violently pushed to the margins, people whose existence is nothing more than a prop to legitimize the primary number, the one that stands alone. Tokens, when we're tokenized, we're being rendered as zeros. We don't add anything to the conversation. Our presence isn't meant to bring any kind of change. It is only meant to legitimize the system, to provide them with a shield against charges of racism, sexism, or other forms of discrimination. Ones are not threatened by the zeros they create, but twos. Twos are a threat. Twos are a threat to isolationism, to the patriarchy and racial logics of a binary system of ones and zeros, because twos reject that binary. There's no longer a binary now. Twos are kwe and nin. Twos are more than resistance, they are refusal. And that's the name I landed on for that podcast conversation about gender. Refusing the patriarchy, refusing the binary of ones and zeros, not just resisting it, which still gives it a place in the center. We refused patriarchy and created our own expansive center. And this is what I love about the rainbow symbolism that the queer community has adopted and its expanding vision, because rainbows are expansive. Rainbows don't have rigid lines between the colors. One color bleeds into the next and it kind of glows a little bit. And depending on your perspective, where you're looking, where you are, when you see that, different colors may glow brighter. But somebody else looking at the same rainbow might see other colors glowing brighter. They might see it as a complete hemisphere, a complete, half circle of a rainbow that looks like a dome. It's the most beautiful thing, protecting everyone beneath it. I've only seen that once. I was on our way home. We were on our way home from out east, and we had stopped to see this really cool lighthouse that also conveniently offered free camping, which was actually why we went there. It was free camping. It wasn't like the cool lighthouse, but that was cool too. And it had been really overcast that day, which isn't super fun for traveling. But as we were walking, it was this beautiful rainbow, and it was like a full semicircle, and the top of it was glowing, which I'd never seen before. So it might have been like the time of day or the way the light was hitting it or something. But the top of it was glowing, and it looked like it protected everything that was underneath it. It just looked like this beautiful protective thing. Because that's what happens when we acknowledge the agency of zero. India often gets credit for discovering or inventing zero, and it did. But the Mayans also discovered it. And I don't mean the idea of zero as a placeholder or as a nothing, because that's been around for a really long time. But the idea of zero as something in itself, not a negation, but in its own place of possibility. And that's basically the extent of my mathematical knowledge of zero. I don't know if you've seen the movie Everything Everywhere All at Once, but as silly as it is, there are some really profound moments, like when Alpha Waymond tells Evelyn, and that of all the Evelyns in all of the universes, because she's the least accomplished of all the Evelyns. Has anybody seen this movie? Yeah, it's hilarious. And remember when he tells her this, it's like, you're the biggest loser. And she's like, what? And he's like, no, that's amazing. Because when you have the least, you're capable of the most. So because she was the least accomplished, she was the one capable of learning the most, which I thought was really cool. So when we acknowledge the agency of those who are rendered zero, when we stop seeing them as a negation or a placeholder and see them as having agency on their own, that's a place of immense potential and possibility. It changes everything. Particularly because as I was reminded this morning by the math major in the room, 0 plus 1 stays 1. But if you multiply anything by 0, it becomes 0. It changes it. And I'm still processing this idea. I'm sorry, it's very typical when I give my remarks for the people who are listening to me to have to listen to me process things as I'm adding them to my framework. But this idea of ones and zeros and the possibilities that result when we refuse the binary, and I haven't even started to think about what imaginary numbers might contribute. Refusal of patriarchy offers expansive vision, but it also comes with costs that I don't want to minimize. It comes with threats and retaliation. It comes with exclusions based on the threat of dissent, which is a book that we should all be reading right now. It's called Threat of Dissent. We don't even have to protest or organize or take tangible steps against oppressive actions of a racist patriarchal society that sees everyone who is not a white, cis, probably heterosexual Christian as a zero. Just the threat of dissent has, historically speaking, been enough to trigger a violent reaction from the state and its organs. It has resulted in police actions and repressions and deportations and exclusions. The existence of twos, the agency of zeros have resulted in violence that is either produced or exploited by the state. And one thing I learned in this book, I've learned a lot in this book, is that in the 70s, the Supreme Court ruled twice that your First Amendment right to free speech includes the right to hear and read. In the U.S., in somebody or other versus the U.S. Postal Service, the Postal Service was refusing to allow like materials by anarchist or Marxist people to be sent through the mail. They're like, no, you can't mail that. Like, there's a lot of stuff you're not allowed to mail. You can't mail, dangerous things. Can't mail drugs. Can't mail anarchist thought, I guess. And so this person took it to the court, and it went all the way up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said no. Free speech includes the right to read. And there was another court case that stipulated that free speech includes the right to hear, which means that university campuses are perfectly poised to be places of conversation, just like this lecture, just like other lectures. I mean, I was watching the slideshow of lectures you guys have coming up, and it's an amazing collection of speakers that you guys have. Iman Abdalati is speaking in 2 days on Palestine and the future of U.S. campus activism. And I hope that you go to hear her. I heard her speak at the Socialism Conference in Chicago. And she's a very articulate, powerful voice. She's somebody who should be heard. And if you can't get in, then I hope that you gather outside to offer support, because I am sure there will be dissenters present. And for her to have the support of people who believe not only in her right to speak, but in their right to listen is really important right now. Because people like Iman and others open up the space to have these difficult conversations, to learn how to have. That's something I learned in this when I was doing these podcast series, not just talking to interesting people, but also learning how to have these conversations about inequity, about my role in different things. Because although I am an Indigenous woman, I am also university educated, married to a white guy who made a lot of money. Not tons of money, we're not wealthy, but we own our own house, okay? We're that kind of wealthy. We wouldn't be able to afford it now, but 25 years ago we could. So I do have layers of access, and I tend to think of access rather than privilege, because privilege just sounds so fancy. But access, I do have access to places. I do have certain freedoms. My passport will send me home to Canada, right? If ICE decides that I'm too brown for Portland tomorrow. Which they're active in Portland right now, so that's not even a joke. But I travel with a Canadian passport, which gives me entrance to something like 186 countries in the world. I think it's 2 more than the US has access to. We're winning. Maybe y'all are going to have less access soon. So I do have access to places, and I have the ability to speak. And that's actually a powerful thing that guest lecturers bring to campuses, is we can say things that maybe your professors can't, because what are you going to do? Not invite me back? I'm probably not coming back anyway. So I don't know, maybe I will. I would love to come back to talk about Bad Indians Book Club. I just mean that the threat to me is not the same as the threat to a professor who might be facing a tenure committee, who may not be able to speak up in certain ways. Maybe, through fear or coercion, you got to keep your medical benefits. Like, at least in Canada, we don't have to worry about getting fired and losing our medical benefits. At least, our universal health care isn't actually that universal, but it's better than nothing. And so if we got fired, we get let go, we can still go to the doctor without fear of going bankrupt. So there's all these different ways that people are controlled and constrained. All of this brings me to the most useful definition of racism that I've ever come across. And I love it because it can apply so broadly. It's about racism, but applies very broadly to all sorts of things. Because the cost of dissent, the cost of difference, of refusing to be a zero without agency is real. This definition comes from Ruth Wilson Gilmore. She's a geographer by training. Do I have any geographers in the room? Geography majors? Yes. If I had known that the best decolonial thinking right now is coming from the field of geography, I probably would have stayed in it longer. I didn't at all. I took it in high school and then never looked back. I didn't know geography could be so cool, though. And when I mentioned to a friend of mine this, he's like, Patty, it's just the study of land and people. Like, what could be more Indigenous than that? It's like, good point. So Ruth says, racism, specifically, is the state-sanctioned or extra-legal production and exploitation of group-differentiated vulnerability to premature death. And I really like that because it focuses us on 2 things. It focuses us on what's at stake. that it's not just about hurt feelings and being excluded from a room, although those things are real. It's about the outcome of those exclusions and about who is vulnerable to premature death in a group differentiated way. Yes, white people die of things too. White people live in poverty, bad things happen to them. But when you tease out the metrics, we're winning. In all of the ways that life can suck, Black and Indigenous people are winning. Queer people are winning. These are not contests we want to win. So I really like that definition because it hones us in on what's at stake here, on the cost of being rendered a zero. What are the mechanisms of that vulnerability, and how can we organize against it? Because organize we must. Taking the time that we need, as the deer did, keeping that space and those values as the center that we can return to again and again, and then coming together in relationships that refuse our negation. I'm a writer, so of course I think about books as a place to begin organizing. And reading groups have a long history of being the starting point for collective change. We came under the sign that says the truth will set you free. And I'm sorry, the truth will not, in fact, set you free. You have to allow it to move you to action. We don't just passively absorb the things that we read. Books change us because we engage with them. We wrestle and argue with them. The power of book clubs and reading groups lies not in just who we read, but who we read with and why. In his book, The Message, Ta-Nehisi Coates writes about the impact of words from his early years. And I read his book, recalling that, like Coates, I too lay on my bed at 5 years old, murmuring phrases from one or another of those childcraft series that he mentioned. It's like this old set of encyclopedias with children's stories and stuff. The images and stories haunting my play as works read through adolescence and then adulthood would find their way into my thoughts and actions. And I too made the transition from reader to writer when, in a fit of anger against injustice and false history, it occurred to me that I could also shape the stories being told. Now my words haunt others. I stay with you throughout your day and in your work. And it is a profound and humbling thing to realize this, to realize not only the power that reading and writing has to change the world, but my own place in that work. Because it is a political act, this demand to be seen and read across genres on our own terms and not as some sidekick, a binary zero existing only to save the white hero. Coates's book was written to the young writers that he teaches, imploring them to do their part to save the world. I believe in the power of reading to change the world, because reading has the power to change us. If we are going to be changed and then change others, we must read intentionally, but more than intentionally, I want to read radically. I want you to feel what is at stake in a world of book bans and alternative facts, to grasp the value of listening to those who are pushed to the edges in the communities we build there. But more important than reading is protecting these books, which means getting involved in the places that control access to them. Places like libraries and schools where the decisions are being made. Hold events at community centers and independent bookstores. Start your own Bad Indians book club in the places where they will least expect it but desperately need it. Don't just read banned books. Become engaged in the places where they're being taken off the shelves. And remember, above all, the first rule of Bad Indians Book Club: always carry a book. Miigwech.
Are you willing to take some questions?
I will, yes, and I will stay very close to this mic while I answer them.
So I will bring the microphone to you if you have a question. Please make sure it's a question. And I'd love to open up the discussion.
Oh, there, we got a hand right up front.
Thank you.
So I heard you mention your kin. I was kind of confused what you mean. Like, could you explain more on your kin?
My kin?
Yeah.
Do you mean, okay, so kin, I mean, it's a broad term, right? So I talk about my family as my kin. But then also we have friends and community members, and people with whom we are in kinship, we're in that kind of kinship relation. So yeah, so it could mean, so that's probably where the confusion is. She talking about family? Is she talking about her community? So yeah, I was talking about both. Just making like Phil Donahue. Anybody remember Phil Donahue? Boomers and elder Gen X in the room know who I'm talking about. Our moms watched it, and we watched it when we were home from school.
I wanted to say, first of all, thank you so much for the talk. It was beautiful and also made me laugh, which is something I need right now. When you're talking about not just interacting with banned books on your own, but getting involved in the spaces where they are being harmed or damaged, can you explain a little bit more about what that would look like? Is it donating to libraries? Is it going to like council meetings or trying to fight the laws in the government? What exactly does that interaction look like on like the individual level?
It means all of those things. Miriam Kaba actually put out a really good toolkit for people who want to get involved. It can look like becoming a trustee for your kid's school board. It could mean, becoming involved in the library. I don't know how your libraries are governed here, but it could mean getting on that board. Because really, I've been reading a lot about Christian nationalism. Like a lot of us have. And I'll tell you, they have done a really good job of getting their people into the places where those decisions are being made. So they're the ones that are running the school boards, the library boards, the church board, all of those places where the policies are being made. And why aren't we there? Like, we should be there. We should be in those places. We should be the dissenting voice at the table saying, why are we banning that book? We should not be banning that book. I often recommend that if you're going to do that, that you make sure you go with a friendly so that you can make the motion and your friendly will pass it, or the other way around. Even if it's just to get the discussion on the table, you may not get the motion passed. That's my son's strategy. He organizes in Halifax. But yeah, it could mean donating books to the library that you think that they should have on the shelf, but their budgets have been slashed. The Haymarket Books Book Club is freaking amazing. It's like super cheap in terms of like how books cost. You get like overwhelmed with books. Donate them to the library. If you have the financial wherewithal to do that. So it's all kinds of different ways. The one that works for you, my point being, we need to be there in those places where the decisions are being made. We need to be writing letters to the people, to our governments, the people who claim to represent us, and say, I didn't say they did represent us, I claim to, saying that we're not okay with these decisions being made. And it was Miriam Kaba who actually got me thinking about that, because she tweeted out something about, just hating these I read banned book bags. Like, who cares? Do something about it. Do something about why they're banned in the first place. So yeah, I mean, it could look like all of those things you're mentioning, but I don't even know how to help you find the website for her. But if you Google like Miriam Kaba book ban toolkit, you'll probably find it.
Thank you so much. I think it's great to talk about libraries, because I found your book through our local library.
I love libraries.
It was a suggested book, and I was like, this looks fantastic. So I have kind of two questions. One is, in your book, you talk about how Anishinaabe is a verb-based language.
Yes.
And I'm a poet, so I found that to be especially inspiring. And I was wondering how we can use that change of mindset from like English as a noun-based language to thinking more verb-based, and how that can change how we're interacting with our society, with each other, with the land, and also in the midst of sort of the onslaught that we're dealing with right now, where there are attacks on so many different things from so many different directions, what guidance you might have for how to figure out where we can make the most effort, because I feel like I personally am overwhelmed by the options, and I'm like, where do I start? So. verb-based language and prioritization of our energy.
Yes. Yeah. So Anishinaabe, a lot of the languages that emerged here are verb-based, which means, so this is not a microphone. This is the thing that makes me sound loud. I don't know if that's how the Anishinaabe would describe it, but something like that. You know, it's not a chair. It's the thing I sit on. It's, my shirt is not blue. It's being blue. So it describes a state of being. It's a quantum physics way of thinking, really. Lawrence Gross, in his book, Anishinaabe Ways of Knowing and Being, talks about the quantum physics nature of our languages. And Indo-European languages are noun-based, so they talk about discrete things. And so in terms of how do we incorporate that, it's thinking relationally. It's thinking, well, what is my relationship to this thing? And like I said about the rainbow, different perspectives may see the same rainbow completely differently. It's still a rainbow, nobody's saying it's not, but we emphasize different things. And so are there other ways that we can engage or relate? I think about it in terms of storytelling. Are there other ways I can engage with these stories? Are there other ways? And also, when we talk about it being a verb-based language, we're also thinking about those things having their own agency, having their own life. Like, how does that chair feel about constantly having bums on it, right? How do those rocks, I get so many people wanting me to absolve them of bringing home rocks when they give me stuff. Somebody always wants to say, I love bringing home rocks, is that okay? I'm like, I'm not gonna tell you, but like, you got a lot of spirits in your house that you need to think about, do these things have life? And if they have life, which is the basis for the verb-based language, because we assume that they do, how does that then change my relationship to those things, to those rocks that I bring home, to the things that I plant in my garden? How does that change my relationship to them if I assume that it's not just a zero placeholder, but it's a zero with agency? So that's one piece. And then in terms of the fire hose of chaos that has been unleashed, it's been building for a while. But it's really been unleashed. And that's his strategy too, right? Let's just sow complete chaos. We're going to do all the illegal things. People are going to sue us. They're going to work their way through the courts. And some of them will win. And we don't care because we sowed the chaos we wanted. And that takes up a ton of resources, right? These things have to be challenged in court. They can't be allowed to stand. But that also consumes a lot of resources on a lot of different sides. So what I would say is you're already connected to something. There is something in the midst of all of this chaos that you care about. Do that thing with the people around you and understand that it is all connected. That the thing that I'm concerned about, writing, reading, free speech, the right to hear, the right to listen, the right to talk, all of those things that I'm concerned about is connected to the things that you're concerned about. Is connected to the things that you're concerned about. And so if we all focus on the things that we do care about, the people around us, the relations that we have, the people we see who are vulnerable and being made vulnerable, because it's not that I am vulnerable, I'm being made vulnerable, right? That's another aspect of verb-based language. Vulnerability is not inherent in me. It's a thing that's been done to me. It's a thing that's been done to racialized people, to queer people. It's, so what are the obstacles? What can we work together? And just to understand that they're all connected. We don't have to fix all the things. We just have to trust that everybody is working on the thing that they can work on. And then we form coalitions around common goals. And then those coalitions, like in Golden Gulag, Ruth Wilson Gilmore talks about organizing against a prison build. And you would think that this is something that only abolitionists would care about, right? Like I've got my Haymarket books, you can't see it because it's buried. My Haymarket books t-shirts that says abolish everything. Abolish all the binaries, all the carceral systems, it's all gone. But she was able to build a coalition that included people who were not abolitionists at all. But she helped them understand how this prison was not going to bring jobs, it was going to impoverish. And so they were able to work together on a common goal, even though they didn't share a similar politic. And we can do that. We can get out of our silos and organize with people towards a common goal, even if we don't share the same endgame politic. And who knows, maybe we convert them on the way. But if we don't, that's okay too. because we're not about conversion, not evangelical Christians. You can do your thing and we'll do our thing and it'll be good.
Thank you. And I know that you specifically asked for questions, not comments, but this is sort of an activism right now comment. I was actually just listening to your talk in my office, and I'm supposed to go pick up my kid, but I walked out of the library. I'm like, no, I have to go in. You're talking about books right now. So my wife is a librarian at the Eugene Public Library, and right now the City Council is contemplating some serious cuts to the library and other forms of recreation that serve underserved people like seniors and other things. So if anyone wants to write to their city council right now, this is actually currently happening, and one of the they can do a fire fee, which actually does depend on how much money you have, so it's a good fee in that sense. Doesn't overburden people who can't afford it, that they could pass, but they're also just wanting to maybe just cut things instead, and they have a whole plan where they don't cut anything from fire or police, and they take everything else out of everything else in the budget. Right, and fire and police are more than half the budget combined. And then they have a plan where maybe they cut across the board. But the best plan is the fire fee. So I just want to encourage people, because we have a great public library here that cares a lot about meeting the needs of underserved communities, and also that unfortunately but necessarily serves to give people warm places to go when they don't have them. And it would be great if there were better services that were designed for that, but right now the library is one of those public spaces that people can't be removed from unless they start screaming obscenities at people. But anyway, so I just want to encourage people, if you're looking for something to get involved with this right now, do get involved with, writing to your city councilor and saying, yes, we actually do care about the library. We do consider it an essential service, not just fire and police, and also maybe there's room for cuts there. I don't know. But anyway, so I apologize for sort of popping in here to grandstand, but I promise I was listening to the whole talk before I came in 2 minutes ago, and I really appreciated it.
Yeah. No, thank you so much for bringing that up, because people are asking, what can we do? And so giving them an opportunity to do something with how I've just made you all feel. I appreciate you doing that. I love libraries. They are one of the few places where we can go hang out and not be expected to spend money. Right? And they're a place of ideas. And, you go browsing the shelves looking for one book and you find it lined up with another. Like, it's just, they're such extraordinary, radical places. I understand why they want to cut funding to them, particularly in a, conservative political climate. But yes, they are absolutely an essential service.
Hi.
Oh, and sorry, just remind in your letters, remind them that the Supreme Court, somebody or other via U.S. Postal Service, you have a right to read. That's a Supreme Court right. They should not mess with that.
Beautifully said. Thank you. I wanted to ask you, because I think it was mentioned in the beginning that you were doing a lot of social work in your earlier life as well. And as a scholar of sociology, I think a lot of us are dissuaded from doing social work because it's not an immediate contributor to capital. So I just wanted to ask you, what your experience in social work was and what you feel like you got out of it.
Well, my experience was terrible because I did child welfare. And it wasn't terrible because of the families. I'm always very clear when I say that. I understood why the families were behaving the way they were behaving. I understood why they didn't trust me. For the most part, they were doing the best they could. We always want people to make better choices, right? That's the big mantra. They should make better choices, and we would say that. Except that we never talked about the limited choices that people have. Oh, if you want to get your kid back, you have to do counseling, except that counseling has an 18-month wait list, and we've already been in court for 12 months, and so your child needs permanency. Sorry. The trouble that I experienced with social work was realizing that I was not the princess in this story. I had my own Disney princess moment, realizing that I had gone into the field trying to help people and realizing that I was, in fact, the bad guy in the room, that I was not, in fact, keeping children safe, and that kind of broke me. And social work as a whole field has a really big white supremacy problem, because it really is about helping people
kind of assimilate or fit into the existing society, and it doesn't question as often as it should whether that existing society is something that we should want people to be adapting into. That said, there are a lot of Black and Indigenous and other, and queer and other diasporic peoples who are in the field of social work who are bringing a completely different lens to that practice. They are not in child welfare for the most part. They are in other fields of social work, working with addictions and loss and the unhoused population and other refugees, and they're the ones that are out there questioning this system. And so, yes, so my experience of social work, at least I learned how to review history and write service plans, which is basically what Becoming Kin is. It's a history review with a service plan. But there are, which is also, that's Bad Indians Book Club, right? It's what changes if we listen to people who are pushed to the margins. What changes about history, about science, about memoir, about our vision of the future, about our experience of horror. What changes when we listen to the people who are pushed to the edges? Because I'll tell you, when you've been pushed into the dark and forced to make friends with the things that live in the dark, the things that scare you are not the same things that scare white people. And so we write very different horror. We envision a different future. We're not looking ahead to a post-apocalyptic world. The apocalypse is in our rearview mirror. Right? So our futurisms are expansive and utopic and building and, looking towards good things. And so, so in the field of social work, I would say if you read looking at the marginalized thinkers and how they are changing the practice of social work, because it needs to be changed, and they are the ones who are leading that change.
Thank you. I know everyone keeps saying thank you, but everything you're saying is like resonating miles.
That's wonderful to hear.
One point that really made me think was sort of the beginning when you were talking about how you bring your relations into a room and how do you manifest those stories into how you show up in the world. And I think in a time of such polarizing and aggressive politics, living as somebody who is supported and uplifted by the privilege, and also actively being attacked by the politics that are happening right now, I've been struggling with being proud of my activism and also not actively being upset at the privilege that also comes with because my dad is white and he says he supports and he's an activist and he supports my mom who is actively being put down by these systems. And so my gut is to obviously support and uplift my mom's voice, but I feel that strong guilt and upset at the privilege and blissful ignorance that comes with that whiteness and that white history. So I was just wondering how you live through that and show up in such a beautiful way.
Well, thank you. Yeah, that is hard. That is challenging, because would I like to say that I'm just Anishinaabe and be firmly on that one, in that one camp? Sure. I'm sure I would. But I can't. Not only because phenotypically I don't, I'm brown, but I'm not kind of as dark as my cousins. People at home usually think I'm either Italian or Portuguese. When I keep saying no, they start getting really frustrated. Well, you're Spanish. What, you this, or you that? They never guess Native. Native people always oh, you're Native. Where are you from? But white people are are you Italian? Somebody once asked me if I was Japanese because they were running out of options. And I was like, no. I don't even see that, but whatever, dude. But also, so it's not just that aspect of it, but my grandma, for all that, she found safety in Hitler's Germany, was also a wonderful woman who taught me a lot. And her family contains musicians and engineers. My mom, you want to talk about relationship to land, that woman can coax food out of any patch of land you give her. And she is generous. And yes, she's evangelical Christian who thinks Jesus is coming back. So there's, yay Israel and all of that stuff. So there's some interesting conversations around our dinner table. But there's also like some really good, valuable qualities. And I think it's that wrestling and acknowledging, kind of acknowledging the gaps and the distance between who we wish people were and who they actually are, or what our history was versus what it actually is. Aurora Levins Morales offered me something really beautiful that I put in Becoming. I don't offered me personally. She wrote a book and I read the book. I felt like she offered it to me, but I've never actually talked to her. So sorry if I gave that impression. Where she talks about her family being descended from slave owners. And instead of ignoring or absolving or whitewashing that history, she acknowledges it. And then she thinks about her own position as an abolitionist and how transformative that is. And that would not be a transformative story if she just ignored that history. And so that's where I think about our relations. I think about my grandma's story, and I think about my grandpa's story and what that must have been like to live his whole life with his wife calling him by her dead husband's name. Like, that's like a whole other level of everything. So I think about what my challenges, and I make sure that I advocate on the side of people who are being displaced, because if my grandma benefited from it, then that's my responsibility. And so maybe that's thing of things that you benefit from, your access. You want to talk about, your privilege or your access. What are you benefiting from? Well, how can I work against that? If I benefit from the displacement of Indigenous people, then I can advocate for land back. But I'm also going to recommend that tarot book to you, 78 something. That's really not helpful, is it? Sorry. 78 Acts of Liberation, Tarot to Transform Our World. And even if you're not into tarot, the social justice lens that she brings to it and brings to her discussions about the themes that are contained within tarot are really interesting. And she just talks, I just finished reading a little bit where she is talking about the problem of allyship. And, when we think that we're an ally and now we've arrived, right? And now we know the stuff, and now we're here to save you because I have all this privilege and knowledge, and so now I'm going to save you. And it's like, okay, so in Indigenous spaces, I'm Native person, but I'm not queer. That's not my lived experience. So that's a space where I'm an ally or an accomplice or a friend or a colleague or a comrade, or any one of those things. I'm there to learn and to understand how I can best support from within my own context. And so anyway, I just bring that book because she has a really good discussion of that. And it is, it's a great book. I've already been marking it up and stuff. So yeah, it's just really cool to think about tarot from a social justice lens, which is where I got the whole thing about ones and zeros and all of that, because it was just tarot is often such this insular, how am I going to make myself a better person, white girl thing. But Lane makes it this big, expansive, collective thing, because tarot comes from the Romani people. It doesn't come from the upper classes, which was news to me.
Would you take just a few more questions?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
I'm going to stand so I'm not a disembodied voice.
Thank you.
This question is definitely along the lines of the question that was just asked, but I think that slightly different. I'm a doctoral student. I'm new to pedagogy in the classroom at the college level. And what you've said about reimagining has really resonated with me. I am solo teaching a class this term on reimagining public lands and sort of speaking from the margins about that. And I'm wondering if you have strategies for classrooms, whether they're college classrooms or sort of community classrooms, right? In not just navigating the guilt that arises personally, but more how to help students navigate that guilt to move to a place where reimagining can be really generative and not born out of guilt that kind of holds them back.
Yes, because guilt can be very paralyzing, right? And guilt can also be a crutch, an excuse. I feel like that's how my fundraiser, Pay Your Rent, got started because of some white man feeling just so bad about being white and living on it. And I tell you, that kind of stuff is exhausting to listen to, because what they really want is absolution. They want to be told that it's okay. And it's never going to be okay to build a kinder, more inclusive settler colonialism. right? That's the problem in leftist spaces, is they don't want to reckon with the fact that they're still organizing on Indigenous land. They want to build a kinder, more inclusive settler colonialism, and that's not okay. So that's what they want. When they're the guilt, they're looking for absolution. So I don't give it to them. And what I told him to do was, if you feel so bad, then pay your rent. And that's how my pay your rent fundraiser got started, because I thought, wow, that's actually a good idea. But even paying rent is a kind of absolution, right? Because you can donate money, but you're not actually making any change. You're not changing your life in any way. And there's actually a whole field of altruism that says that you should go and get a really high-paying job so that you can donate more money, except that the high-paying jobs are exploitative and terrible, or based on exploitative and terrible practices. And so no, we don't need more exploitation just so that you can make more money to donate to the people that you've impoverished. Which is why we also support organizers, which is why we're also building a newsletter and resources to kind of mobilize our donors so that they do more than pay their rent. But that's what I would suggest to the students that are feeling the guilt is, well, what are you feeling guilty about? Do something about that thing, because you can't fix it, right? Like, there are harms that I did when I was a child welfare worker that I can't fix, that I can't apologize for. Like, the day that broke me was when a client told me that I had ruined her life, and she was right. And I had argued every step of the way with my supervisor about the things that we were doing. I said, this is not helping. This is making things worse. And every step of the way, I had to follow orders. And when I realized that, my brain just kind of went, and then I got a PTSD diagnosis, and that's a whole other story. But yeah, and so that's part of where this foundation came from. I can't fix those things that I did, but I can help them not happen to other people. I can do something about this. I can't fix that thing, but I can organize against it being perpetuated by others. Because whatever they're feeling bad about, they're not the only ones who did it. Chances are the whole system did it, the whole system absolved them, and now you're taking that absolution away from them. But they can do something with that. They can transform it, like you were talking about with your own history. And transformation is a beautiful thing, and I don't know why more Christians aren't behind that, because I thought transformation was like their whole jam.
Thank you so much, Patty. It is very refreshing to me to hear someone referring to books the way you have, because book for me have always been a place of comfort, a safe place. So, but my question is, in this cultural atmosphere that we live in right now, how we do engage to those books that are not a safe place? How do we exist with those books?
How do we
approach them? How do we live in this narrative of these books that are going to circulate in the current atmosphere, political atmosphere?
So you mean books that are contributing to this atmosphere of fear? Books that are basically like, yay, Christian nationalism is awesome. That kind of thing? Okay. I mean, we write our own books and we tell our own stories and we create book clubs and we create space to elevate our books and our stories. Right? I'm a big fan of, maybe there are people who are going to destroy them, crash their car into the Christian bookstore so that it can't sell books. Be an interesting form of praxis, but I'm not advocating it in case the NSA is listening. They probably are listening. I'm just saying that, we could take that kind of approach to it, but then the conversation becomes about silencing and allows them to play the victim, which we don't want them to do that. And so I tend more towards building. What can I build? Here are the margins that you've shoved me into. What can I build here with other people? And that's the power of diaspora as well. Is you may want to keep us all in our little ethnic enclaves, but you've dispersed us. And now we're talking to each other and we're realizing that our struggles aren't just similar, they're connected. And now we're organizing transnationally against you. Because you bet they're meeting transnationally, right? They get together for their G10s and 20s and whatever's at Davos, and those EDs are all talking to each other and planning their strategies for how they're going to. We should be doing that too. across, transnationally, and we are doing that. Diaspora forces us to do that, forces us to engage with people outside of the community we might feel safe, our little insular communities. So I would say, to counter those narratives, bring your own. I'm going to recommend this book again. Buy it, put it on your coffee table, and really freak out your Trump-loving evangelical relatives. Because not only is it tarot, but it's tarot to transform our world, and that'll just send them right over the edge. But also, even having books. I'm a big fan of building personal libraries. My to be read pile is so huge. Give books to people. Start book clubs. Get involved in that stuff. And I would say, elevate. Because we could expend a lot of energy fighting that other stuff, or we could spend all that energy building. And there will always be people who are angry enough at that other stuff to fight it. And so I'm going to they can do what they want to do. I'm interested in what can I build. And the world has changed because of reading, because of book clubs, because of consciousness raising, because people get together and they read and they talk and then they engage with their world differently. Like y'all are going to be writing to politicians tonight to save your library. That's perfect. You should be doing that.
I think we might end it there. I want to thank you for this wonderful talk. Maybe we can give another round.
Yay, thank you. Thank you guys so much.